American Television with Mitchell Hadley is the show, and I am Dan Schneider. We're going to do another couple of shows today on some forgotten people in the television industry that should be more remembered. Up first will be Bill Cullen, but before we do that, Mitchell Hadley is on the other side of the screen. Mitch, if you can just give a little background about who you are.
Sure, I am a classic TV and pop culture historian. I write about television at the website itsabouttv.com, all one word. I have two books about TV out. My most recent one is called Darkness in Prime Time, and it deals with how television, particularly from the 50s and 60s, prophesized the descent into hell that our modern society has become.
So, we're going to be talking about Bill Cullen. I have to say, in terms of game shows, he's probably one of the people that I remember the most in the earliest because he was on virtually everything. But by the same token, I can understand why he's not quite remembered today the way, say, Bob Barker was, or even Monty Hall. Monty Hall has a physics problem named after him, or a mathematical conundrum, I should say. So, who was Bill Cullen, and why do you think, just to start off, why do you think that he sort of faded?
Well, Bill Cullen was known within the industry as the game show host's game show host. He was incredibly respected not only by producers but by other game show hosts. He was considered the one man to go to when you were trying out a new show, when you were looking at the formats. He was quick-minded. He had worked a lot in live television. He knew how to handle situations when they didn't go right, and he had a personality that was just perfect for his role. Now, you hit on exactly the reason why he's not so well remembered as some hosts today. One, it's because we're away from the golden age of TV game shows when all the networks had maybe a half dozen shows each that would dominate the morning or the afternoon hours. And you really got to know these hosts, especially in during those daytime hours when you still had a lot of housewives watching TV, when you had the product placement that you had back then, when daytime television as a network property was extremely important. He was on all the time with various shows, and this is why he's not well remembered, because he's not identified with just one show. He's identified with many shows that he did throughout the years, probably most famous for the original Price is Right, but he was on all kinds of shows throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and he also appeared as a panelist on shows. The other thing about his personality is that his strength was also the reason why he might not be as well remembered as some other hosts. He was very modest and unassuming. He had one principle above all, which was do not overshadow the show. Do not become the center point of the show. The competition is the show. The guests are the show. The rules of the game are the show. When he was on a panel show like I've Got a Secret, the participants are the show. The show is bigger than I am. And so the very thing that made him popular on these shows, which was that he didn't draw attention to himself, is ultimately why he's not as well remembered as some others, because he doesn't have a dominant personality that overwhelms what he's doing. He's just a steady, hardworking, well respected, well loved host. And that's perfect when you are active. It doesn't work as well in the kind of remembering that we have nowadays, when people are more remembered for being flashy and being all over the place rather than simply being the best at what they are.
I think another reason that came to me as you were speaking was within the game show universe, especially here in America, he was well known. But other people who are well known in the game show area also well known outside the game show
Hmm.
area. For example, the person we're going to talk about next, Henry Morgan, was a humorist and on radio for a few decades. Kitty Carlisle was a Broadway star. Bennett Cerf was the editor of Random House.
Publisher of Random House, yeah.
And then you had other people who were, stars on other television shows or movie stars that would come in for
Hmm.
an episode or sit for a week to fill a void, or some were newsmen. Mike Wallace hosted game shows for a while. He was one of those people who was a pure product of the game
Yes,
show side of television.
he
He
was.
wasn't infiltrating in from other
Hmm.
areas.
Yeah, if you look at his early career, which is as good a place as any to start, I suppose, like so many of the people who become involved in television, he got his start in radio. And this was, back in the late 30s and early 40s. He worked for local stations before he got into larger markets. He was an announcer, he was a DJ, he was a staff announcer and personality. And very quickly, those were the qualities that served him as getting into the game show genre. First on radio quiz programs, and then going into television. So one of the reasons why he doesn't have a wider body of work is because he never needed it. And by that I mean his work in radio took him almost immediately into working in a very popular medium at the time, which was the quiz show slash game show. And so, as he excelled at that, he never made a transfer into either serious acting or commentating to any great degree. Now he. Having said that, he was on Monitor, NBC's radio program, along with Henry Morgan. Interestingly enough, he was one of the announcers on there, and he did serve a brief stint as a co-host on NBC's version of Wide World of Sports, which was called NBC Sports in Action. Um, but those are, especially the sports gig, that's not very well known. I'm not even sure that there is any video that still exists of him on that show. He was really more of a studio host than going out in the field and reporting like Jim McKay would. But aside from those kinds of deviations, you're right, his career almost stays entirely within the game shows. And the one exception in within the game show field is that when he was the host of the original Price is Right, that was on in prime time as well as during the day. It was on 5 days a week during the day, and then it was on one night a week. And when it was on NBC, it was in color. So that shows that it was one of the shows that NBC valued, because that was a rare crossover in the game show field. A lot of the game shows that you see that are on prime time are the shows that you remember, like $64,000 Question. But you did have the dating game, the newlywed game, Let's Make a Deal. They all had nighttime periods, and I've Got a Secret, but his run on The Price is Right did take him into prime time for some time, and so that added to his base of familiarity as a game show host. You're right, though, that is one of the things that I think you can attribute his relative lack of familiarity to today. Oh, if but for people, people who watch the Game Show Network or Buzzer or some of the other game show channels where you get the retro games, he's certainly very familiar to people on there.
So when I was a kid, I can't say that Cullen stood out to me. He was just one of those people like a Dennis James or a Bob Barker or a Bert Convy, who was one of these game show guys. Then about a decade or so ago, I spent a couple of years working an evening shift at a local school, and so in the early afternoons before I'd go to work, I'd spend maybe an hour just watching a couple of the old repeats of game shows on the buzzer. network, which was new then.
Hmm.
And I had found out in the interim about his polio, suffering from polio, and his physical restrictions. And knowing that in mind, it was interesting to watch the old, especially the black and white older versions of the shows that he did when he was usually a panelist on I've Got a Secret or something. They never showed him. They would show him like coming out, being introduced, but you'd never see him sort of hobbling off to sit down. It would go directly to the next panelist or
Hmm.
something, and so they were very circumspect in not revealing. It was sort of, I guess, the game show equivalent of FDR. You know how the most of the nation didn't even know FDR was handicapped and had to, walk around. I don't think 99% of people back in the '60s had no idea Cullen had a handicap.
No, you're right, because they did often have him either perched on a stool or seated behind the desk from the very beginning of the show. So, whereas it wasn't unusual to have hosts like Jeff Edwards, for example, come running out onto the stage from behind a curtain, which made them again more colorful and more memorable. That wasn't the way he came across on TV. So you're right. It was not a big deal to him, but it because of that, it wasn't that evident to the people who were watching TV. Now, it was known. The people who were doing the show with him were certainly aware of it, but it wasn't something that was really known to the public at large.
So one of the things too that I recall about Cullen was because he did so many game shows, hosted so many things, and each game show in that era had a syndicated version, a morning version, sometimes a primetime version. Because some of these shows there was still the 7:30 p.m. Eastern time slot. What I forget what the term was before they got rid of that half hour that they gave to local stations, but. He didn't seem to be associated with a lot of those things, like you said. There was some host, Chuck Barris was the wacky game show host. Alex Trebek, people thought he was a genius because he knew all the answers, even though he had the cards with the answers in front of him. Other one, Bob Barker was known for his animal rights stuff. The guy who did Password, Alan Ludden, was known for later on his relationship with Betty White, and also for having some snappy comebacks. Bert Convy was known for being a ladies' man, good looking, always flirting with the girls. On Match Game '73, who was the host? Was always
Gene Rayburn.
Gene Rabin was always
Yeah.
looking at the women's cleavage or whatnot. What's his name? Richard Dawson was always trying to smooch every woman in sight. But Bill Cullen, but Bill Cullen was, just Bill Cullen.
Yeah. Well, then, it's fascinating how we keep coming around to this point of view that Bill Cullen was Bill Cullen, and because the very traits that made him so good when he was on TV are those traits that keep you from remembering him. But The Price is Right, I think, was definitely the show that he was most familiar with because it was the one that got the most exposure. But I was just pulling a list of his shows up that I had in my notes. He hosted, I Guess, Three on a Match, The Name's the Same, Tic Tac Doe, Blockbusters. He guest hosted on Password, especially when Alan Ludden was ill. He guest hosted on To Tell the Truth, the revival version of it, when Gary Moore was ill.
Yeah.
There were so many other shows that he was on for a short period of time, shows that didn't have a long running time. I think Blockbusters was probably the best known of the shows that he was on later in his career, but he did so many because he was that good. He was a safe choice. He was smooth, and I think it's important to note too. One of the things about the live era of television that makes it to me at least, so interesting. It's a different era almost of television completely. In the live era, you had to be very quick. You had to be able to adjust if something went wrong. You had to be able to cover if there was a technical problem. You had to be able to work with the contestants in this case so that they would come across as being smooth, that they got over any stage fright they might have, that if there was some kind of a problem, to be able to cover it quickly. And from Cullen's experience on radio and in the early days when he was working on live game shows, um, that became a byword for him, his dependability. And that's why he did get so many game show gigs, because if you were trying out a new show, he'd be the guy you'd want because he'd figure out how to make it work. If you needed somebody to pinch hit, he was already familiar. He'd be able to step in. It wouldn't require a great deal of explanation to the audience. If you needed to find a problem with a format, or if you had a problematic show, he was the guy that you would turn to who could kind of figure out how to make the game work. He wouldn't necessarily be so wedded to the format of the show that he wouldn't be able to figure out how to smooth things over. And yet at the same time, he was very faithful to the format of the show in that he did not let his personality or his any kind of a larger than life status, or trying to make a joke at the expense of either other panelists or contestants. He never allowed that to interfere. And so anybody who's introducing a new show, who's trying to work the kinks out, who wants to give a show a fair chance, who better to call on than a man who is dedicated to making sure that the show does, that he doesn't overshadow the show, that the show is the primary thing. If you were ever going to get a show off the ground and you wanted to have a fair reading of it, Cullen's the guy you want on there because he's going to give you as pure a distillation of the show as you can possibly get.
Was Cullen, who did he work for? Did he work for Goodson Todman? Did he work for any of the networks? Or did he work for like the sponsors? Because as he bounced around, he must have done for all the networks, I would think.
Yeah, he did. And in syndication too,
Yeah.
because he would often host the nighttime version of some of these games. I want to say, although I may be wrong, that he hosted the nighttime version of the $10,000 Pyramid. And
I think so.
I always thought he would have been a terrific host on Jeopardy because he would have allowed the contestants to come through. But his principal association was with Goodson Todman, and that does not exclude other associations. I don't think he ever had a sponsor tie-in that was dominant. He was always very respectful toward the sponsors, unlike our next guest that we'll be talking about. But that was another reason why he was good, because he always did a straight job on there. So he did not, you know, make anybody uncomfortable. But I think when you talk about him, seeing him on Buzzer and seeing him on other of the retro shows, Goodson Todman was much better than a lot of producers at preserving their deposit of programming, and so a lot more of his shows tend to survive than you might see from the Hollywood Squares, for example, where those shows, a lot of them were ruthlessly purged, and a lot of other shows that fall into that category as well. Goodson Todman was pretty good about saving those, whether it was because of the individual producers of the show or because of the policy of the production company itself. So when you see him on shows like I've Got a Secret to Tell the Truth as panelists, you're also seeing him on some of the shows that they produced, that he hosted.
Yeah, another thing that a decade or so ago I noticed differently from my impressions of him as a little boy was in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of panel game shows that have basically had the same format. The three or four big ones from Goodson Todman and a few others probably. But by the time the early 1970s came along, that was sort of waning, and so Cullen seemed to then stick for a few years here, a few years there on certain shows. I have to say, I preferred him as a panelist. Looking back, I preferred him in his younger, crew cut days when he was a panelist, because he seemed to be amongst the best panelists. He seemed to have a sharp mind, and he could guess, whatever someone's job might have been or what their secret might have been, and he seemed to be almost an ideal player, a better player of the games than he was a host. Not that he was bad as a host, but in fact, he may have been that he would have been too good as a panelist, and maybe that's one of the reasons that they wanted him to host a bit.
Well, that you bring up an interesting point there, because when you look at, we've been talking about Cullen the host, or at least I've been putting an emphasis on that, and I've talked about a show like The Price is Right. But Cullen, the panelist, was probably best known for being on I've Got a Secret, and he was on that show for a long time. I don't think that he was on from the very beginning, but he was on nearly from the beginning, he and Henry Morgan. And he always stood out from the other panelists in a couple of really distinctive ways, I think. One of them was that everybody played their role on the show. Morgan was what they called kind of the disruptor. He was the iconoclast. He would include commentary almost with a lot of his questioning. Somebody like Betsy Palmer tried to be was pretty charming. She could be kind of the empty-headed at times. I don't mean that in a cruel way, but sometimes she was comic relief, as opposed to, say, on another show, Arlene Francis, who was always very sophisticated, or Kitty Carlisle, as you mentioned earlier. So they all had their own kind of personas. What Bill Cullen was best known for was solving the problem. His questions were incisive, and he was really thinking through things. He wasn't looking for a cheap joke like so many of the panelists on shows were. If you look at the history of What's My Line, for example, you'll see that they often had comedians on the panel, Steve Allen or Ernie Kovacs or Hal March, if you want to go all the way back to the beginning. And they were on there really to set up jokes, to kind of lighten the mood. And because of that, they weren't always good players, although Steve Allen was a very good player as well. But Cullen was there to play the game, and he did it in such a way that he was able to lead the other panelists in particular directions. He was very good with with both the host. He interacted with the host well, but also with the contestant. I think that he never demeaned them, he never belittled them, he never felt that their secret was for any reason any less important than anybody else's secret. So in that sense, you're right, he was an ideal panelist. He leveraged those same traits that he had as a host to being on the panel. He was the one person that I think every panel show needs. You have your role players, and every one of these panel shows needs somebody who's actually out there playing the game, trying to solve the puzzle. In What's My Line, again, it was Bennett Cerf and Dorothy Kilgallen. On I've Got a Secret, it's Bill Cullen. And that's why he works so well. He's steady, he keeps the show balanced, and yet, and I don't think you can possibly overstate this, and it's one of the reasons I like him so much. All through the early years of television, and I've talked about this in other contexts. If people have heard me say this before or write about it before, bear with me for a minute because it bears repeating. Television was the most intimate of all the entertainment media. It came into your house, it came into your living room, it even came into your bedroom. It was a very intimate form of entertainment, and the people who thrived on it were, I think, those who had those warm personalities, who behaved more like they were a guest than that they were intruding into your home or coming in unannounced. And what Cullen was so spectacularly good at, both as a host and as a panelist, was that warmth that he projected, that likability. I've never heard anyone speak harshly about him. And when you look at everything that you read about him, I mean, there are even Facebook groups dedicated to Bill Cullen. The Bill Cullen Archive is one really good one. But when you read through all of this, you find out that what you see on the show is pretty much what you get with Cullen. The producers knew him as reliable, hardworking, steady, on time. Again, he's not going to try to overshadow the show. It's not about him, it's about the show. His fellow game show hosts, who had a tremendous amount of respect for him, did not look at him as a competitor, and he never looked at himself as a competitor. He always felt he was a colleague. We're all in this business together. We're not competing against each other. We're trying to make a living. And so he was never the kind of presence that projected out to being after your job. And then when you look at him as the panelist on I've Got a Secret, or later, as I mentioned, on the revival of To Tell the Truth, when he was one of the permanent panelists on that show, you see that he's treating the game with respect, and he's treating the contestants with respect. And so from that standpoint, from every standpoint that you look at, he's a perfect personality for what television requires in the early days of the medium. Is that what they would want today? I'm not sure that it is. I think they want flash. They want a certain level of abrasiveness. If you're not talking about Gordon Ramsay, you're talking about somebody at least who has a larger than life persona, where you can actually use this person to sell the show. And you alluded to that very well earlier on when you were talking about how Richard Dawson is Family Feud, Bob Barker is The Price is Right. That isn't how Cullen saw his role. And although he was on his fair share of TV Guide covers, and there were certainly enough stories done about him, and he was identified with those shows, it was more like he was the captain, the steady influence there, as opposed to being somebody who was larger than life.
In the 1960s, throughout the arts, there were what were called new wave artists, new wave movements. There was the French New Wave, the Japanese New Wave in cinema. There was New Wave music. There were, even in crime, crime syndicates, there were New Wave criminals. And it seems to me that game shows went through a similar thing. From a period of about, say, 1968 to 73, we got away from the people on these panel shows who wore dresses and wore evening suits, good suits, to the whole hippie kind of zeitgeist where everything was double entendre. You had the dating game and the newlywed game. You had then later on Match Game, which dominated the 1970s. Again, you had Dawson and Family Feud, and you also had. Like I said, Bert Convy. Every game show he was involved with in the 70s as a host or whatnot, it was always making tattletales. I loved the show, and I still, when I've seen the reruns of it, I love the kind of double entendre that goes on there, because it pushes boundaries from what was maybe Tuesday in the 50s, and it's not quite as vulgar as it is now. Mm-hmm. But it seemed that within that 5-year period, Cullen went from prominence as a fixture of game shows to almost becoming sort of the old man, the dean, and
Yep.
almost as if, if you're watching a Cullen show, it's sort of a throwback, and it's sort of the kind of show that you're going to watch just to, feel good, and then, oh, honey, let's go to sleep. Whereas if you're watching Bert Convy, if you're watching the dating game, you're waiting. You're on tenterhooks, waiting for that snappy reply. Richard Dawson on Match Game, or Charles Nelson Riley is going to say something outrageous, or Paul Lind on Hollywood Squares is going to say something outrageous. And so it seemed that it sort of diverged there, and you had a handful of shows that was still, semi-serious shows. Trebek, when he took over for Jeopardy in 1980 or whenever it was, The Wheel of Fortune. And then you had the shows that were pushing the boundaries, and Cullen certainly was on the safer side there. I'm wondering if that also is one of the reasons he's not as remembered, because what's his name, the guy who did the dating game,
Bob Eubanks.
no, the guy who
Jim Lang.
Who claimed to be CIA spy.
Chuck Barris.
Chuck Barris. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Chuck Barris. They were almost in different universes from Cullen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, you almost have to look at some of those shows. The Barris types of shows are almost a bridge between the game show and reality television, because they're trying to tell a story, I think. And they're telling a very different story from the kind of story that you would see on a more traditional show like The Price is Right. There's an article in an old issue of TV Guide that talks about a woman who had won a tremendous amount of merchandise, great prizes and everything on the show, and it talks about you have to pay taxes on all of that kind of stuff. So it talks about what she did with what she won. But the reason I'm bringing it up in this Cullen discussion, the point is that those shows told a different kind of story. On The Price is Right, you had the plucky housewife, or you had the college student, or you had the naval officer. You had these people who were trying to win, to capture a part of the American dream, to win the kinds of prizes that people at home dreamed of winning. And the question was, were they going to be successful or not? So that was the story that these shows sold. They were selling the American dream through competition. And I think you're absolutely right that was one half of the game show equation. Now, the flashier part of it is selling a different type of story completely. The dating game is selling sex. Who are you going to hook up with? That's a pretty extreme version of it, because that didn't happen very much.
Where was the wildest place that you ever made whoopee?
Yes, on the Newlywed Game, yeah. They both went there, though. They were both about sex, and so they were selling a different kind of a story entirely for that generation, for that time period, for that audience. And so the game show has always, in a way, been about storytelling. But it's the kind of stories that they were telling that were important. As you got into the later era, you're again diverging. You're selling two kinds of stories. On the one hand, you've got a show like Jeopardy, or the Pyramid, or some of what I would call more intelligence shows. I'm not being demeaning in saying that to the others, but they're knowledge-based shows, and so they're selling knowledge as a form of success. You get on there, you're smart, and you're rewarded for it. The other shows are selling a spectacle and greed and avarice. How much money can you win? How many prizes can you take home? Now, the very best shows, I think a show like Wheel of Fortune, for example, and Wheel of Fortune I would digress just a minute to say that Pat Sajak is, in some respects, very much cut out of the same cloth as Cullen. Sajak did not overwhelm the show or overwhelm the contestants. He was a very wry commentator on there, but he didn't try to make Wheel of Fortune all about him. It became about him and Vanna simply because of the longevity and because he was very good at doing what he was doing, but it wasn't inherently about him. Point is, Wheel of Fortune sold a certain level of knowledge. You had to be smart enough to figure out what the puzzle was. You had to be smart enough to know how to use your bi-vowel things. You had to understand if it was a phrase or something. You had to be reasonably conversant in pop culture. And so you had to be able to act under pressure. When it's your turn to answer the puzzle, are you going to be able to do it or are you going to choke? So it sold that element, but it also sold the element of you're winning a lot of money. In the early days, they had that showcase where you could go through and buy certain things with the amount of money that you had. So it sold the materialism, but at the same time, it united it with knowledge. By the time you get to a show like Family Feud, what you're really selling is a form of that, but rather than knowledge, what you're selling is spectacle. Your people aren't tuning in really to see the family that gets all 100 points from the poll. What they're tuning in for is to see how idiotic somebody's answer is. You don't remember the one that hits 59%. You remember the person who has a malaprop or says something, the first thing that comes into their mind, that and you're selling that because you're watching to see how Dawson reacts to it, or you're watching to see how some of the other hosts, if you ever see some of the other countries' versions of Family Feud, you'll see some wonderful reaction shots from those hosts because they get drawn into the answer as a realistic answer for a moment, and then all of a sudden they have this moment of self-awareness where they realize just how stupid that answer actually was, and they become overcome by the sheer idiocy of it and the humor that's involved in it. So you're still involved in all of the storytelling. The best shows tell that story to combine knowledge and success. The worst shows sell it to pounce on greed and avarice and stupidity. But what all of them do is sell a story. When you look at Cullen, what he's selling is the traditional story. The person who comes on a show, who has an interesting background, but who has come on to try to win things that they might need, that they might want, or to display a certain level of knowledge that they have. When he's a panelist, he is drawing out of those contestants, again, their stories. What was their secret? Did they see Abraham Lincoln assassinated? Were they the model for the Indian head nickel? What was the point of what they were doing? And so at all times, he's serving that story, and it's what makes him great. But you're absolutely right. As mores shift, as the culture shifts, and as we get into, I think critically, one of the things about this is that you see game shows move from that point where people dress up and they act rather formally. Although no show is as formal as What's My Line, which is its magic. But you have a certain understood formality about how you behave in public. Then you gradually get to the point where you see contestants where they're starting to wear their name tags on their clothes. So you're not Mr. Jones, you're Bill. You're not Mrs. Smith, you're Janice. And I suspect partly that's because you're filming so many shows or taping so many shows that it also helps the celebrity to remember who they're playing with. But you're getting more informal. And then you go to a show like the Magnificent Marble Machine that's always breaking down, but it's spectacle. Then you go to a show like Family Feud, which is even more spectacle. Um, the marketplace, to a certain extent, determines what the show is going to be like and who's going to be hosting it. And that's why you don't have Bill Cullen hosting some of these more popular shows. It's why you would never have Bill Cullen hosting a program like Family Feud. I don't want to say it was beneath him, but that's not what the kind of a host he is. And I think that he brings gravitas to a program, and Family Feud doesn't require gravitas. As a matter of fact, it doesn't want gravitas.
So before we move on, I just have to say, because of my wife is actually, I believe, the second cousin to Pat Sajak. Pat
Right.
Sajak's mother and my wife's grandmother are cousins, I believe. So
Ah,
that makes her like a second cousin once removed or something like that. But she never, I don't think she's ever met him as an adult. She might have met him when she was a child.
mhm.
But anyway, back to Cullen. So I'm just looking. Cullen apparently was nominated 3 times for an Emmy. Won it once for a game show I have never heard of called, what did I just see? 3 on a Match
Grand Match, yeah.
in
I vaguely
1973.
remember it, but it's certainly not in the Hall of Fame of game
So
shows, I
did
don't
so
think.
did game shows not have a separate category for themselves on either the primetime or daytime Emmys? You know, like
Well,
best show,
at
best
one
host.
At one point, of course, there was only one Emmy show. There were the Emmys, and that covered everything. And then as you got into separate categories for daytime and nighttime, you had a time, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think there was a time when game shows were considered simply daytime programming.
Yeah.
Again, I could be wrong about that, but what it would mean would be you might have somebody like Pat Boone or Ernie Ford who had their own variety shows on during the daytime. You might have somebody like Virginia Graham from the old Girl Talk show, or even some of the other
Dinah Shore.
interview shows. Yeah, yeah, and so and you would have game shows included in there. So you might be the best daytime show host, which encompasses a lot of area.
Hmm.
And I don't know when game shows became a more dedicated category, but certainly what you're seeing as you get into the 80s and even into the 90s, you're seeing a shrinkage, a real shrinkage in game shows. Game shows are going out. You've got more soap operas. All the soap operas are expanding to 1 hour. They're becoming more profitable as a marketing tool. They're getting a bigger audience than the game shows are. So game shows are kind of on the outs. You don't have as many of them. You had more than you do now, which is almost none of them, except in the some of the primetime syndicated stuff. But I think that is one of the reasons too that Cullen isn't as well remembered, because Cullen spans the golden age of game shows, and he died in 1990, so he virtually lived through the entire era of game shows as you and I might think of them before they became what they evolved into, and then gradually into what they are today. For so many years, The Price is Right was the only game show left on TV. So
Yeah. So yeah, and I was just reading because I do remember his last few years before he died of cancer. He did look. He did sort of start looking fairly haggard, and it's interesting because I remember around the same time, Bert Convy, who was probably about 10 or 15 years younger, also died, and I think it was from a kind of disease. But
yeah.
Convy, being with his movie star good looks or whatnot, sort of hid his condition, whereas Cullen basically just sort of accepted that he was withering away. He didn't seem to have the hubris, I guess, or the vanity of, say, the way Convy was. Not to take a dump on Convey.
No, no,
Everyone
I
can.
understand. I understand what you mean, and I think that it comes partly from the company you keep, because of course Cullen was on To Tell the Truth when Gary Moore was going through his cancer and finally had to leave the show, and so Cullen would have been familiar with that. He would have been one of the guest hosts on Password when Alan Ludden was having all his health problems. Cullen came from a different era, and he came from a different mindset, and he came from a different relationship of people that he hung out with, or not hung out with, his contemporaries. You didn't talk about that kind of thing that much. You didn't make a big show of it. So I think, Cullen was not particularly a flashy man in his public life either. So I'm not at all surprised that he would not make a big issue of that, because it wouldn't have been in his character to do so. That's part of why he was such a great figure, of deserving of us talking about him. It always keeps coming back to that same type of thing, that he's steady, professional, reliable, dependable. He's not overshadowing anything, so you may not remember him down the line, but he was a giant of the time.
Well, that's as good a way to end this segment in this show. We'll be back in a moment to pick up talking about Bill Cullen's colleague, Henry Morgan.